by the UN Charter rules on the use of force. These speeches regularly reference the right of self-defense, but the only place where the U.S. can make a legal case for self-defense was Afghanistan. Before October 7, 2001, and the start of the U.S. and United Kingdom armed conflict in Afghanistan, both countries sent a letter to the Security Council reporting that the war there was justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter. It was an international armed conflict whose aim was to achieve the defensive purpose of responding to the 9/11 attacks. And that purpose was achieved by December 2001, when the Taliban fell and left Kabul. By June 2002, when Hamid Karzai took over leadership, it had become a civil war, where the US and UK were fighting alongside Afghanistan. In one of his publications, Professor Lewis takes the position that in a civil war there are geographic limits to the amount of actual force one may use. You are restricted to the actual hostilities within the country. And I agree with that. Where we disagree is whether there are similar types of geographic limits in an international armed conflict. This disagreement between us is hardly relevant at the moment because the United States is not fighting in any international armed conflicts. However, if we had chosen to use, and note that November 2002 date is significant because the Civil War ended, or the Civil War began in June 2002, so we were not, as of that first drone strike, entering into any international armed conflicts. But if we had attacked outside of Afghanistan, it would have been equally unlawful, even during that international armed conflict, because international law does impose limits on the geographic space of conflict. Professor Lewis says that there's no legal authority for the position that I take. That's not true. I've just explained to you that Article 2.4 and Article 51 put very clear limits on the amount of force and where that force can be undertaken. The International Court's judge, Sir Christopher Greenwood, who was my teacher in Cambridge University, has said this about international law's limits on resort to military force in international armed conflicts. Military operations will not normally be conducted throughout the area of war. The area in which operations are actually taking place at any given time is known as the area of operations or the theater of war. The extent to which a belligerent today is justified in expanding the area of operations will depend upon whether it is necessary for him to do so in order to exercise his right of self-defense. While a state cannot be expected always to defend itself solely on the ground of the aggressor's choosing, any expansion of the area of operations may not go beyond what constitutes a necessary and proportionate measure of self-defense. In particular, it cannot be assumed, as in the past, that a state engaged in armed conflict is free to attack its adversary anywhere in the area of war. Professor Lewis attempts to ground his asserted right of unlimited war on the case of the liberation of Kuwait. But this is the most important precedent for the position I take. Everyone in this audience will know that the decision was made after Kuwait was liberated from the Iraqi army not to go all the way to Baghdad and to throw out the regime of Saddam Hussein, despite the views of the Department of Defense Secretary of Defense, Mr. Cheney, and I heard that bell. So this is a case in which the United States and the coalition fighting with it absolutely made clear that we would not expand that war, that international armed conflict, beyond what was necessary to liberate Kuwait and create a security zone on the border between the two countries. Dealing with al-Qaeda and terrorist suspects on the territories of other states that have had no legal responsibility for a significant armed attack on the United States is forbidden by international law. Rather, international law says that the obligation is to use law enforcement measures outside those areas where a country has actually attacked the United States. And I will just briefly, in conclusion, invoke the profound words of my friend and colleague, Professor Layla Sadat of Washington University in St. Louis. She says these drone strikes by the United States in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia show that the administration's approach is starting from a position where targeted killing of individuals living outside the United States are being used as a remedy for U.S. insecurity about future terrorist attacks. The U.S. is pursuing a war paradigm, which takes killing as a given, not a peace paradigm, which takes the protection of life as the most fundamental duty of the state. International law has traditionally drawn a bright line, clearly distinguishing between war and peace, and always giving preference to the measures of peace.
Thank you very much. I do apologize for the ring. First time using this gadget.
It's okay, I expect a similar one, actually. I'd like to thank the United Center for putting this event on. I'd like to thank Judith Lund-Briggs for making this all possible. And all of you for taking the time to come out and hear this discussion. One of the things we heard at the beginning in the introduction that Professor Evangelista gave us was that one of the primary reasons or the primary advantages of drones to the United States is that it protects us or protects our operators. They're 8,000 miles away. They are at no risk while they are conducting strikes against enemies. But that's not the main reason. In fact, it's not even one of the top 2 or 3 reasons why drones are viewed advantageously by the United States. The reasons why they are most important is because they are, as the introduction has indicated, very effective at minimizing civilian casualties. They allow commanders, lawyers, intelligence officers, and others to take one last look before a trigger is pulled, which is impossible in any other warlike situation. You can't be on the ground next to the private with a rifle with special forces individual going into a compound. But you can be literally looking over the shoulder of the drone operator before he pushes the button. And that makes a tremendous difference in your ability to assess the legality and the effectiveness of each strike that is taking place. In addition, drones, as we heard, the Hellfire missile is the primary weapon that drones use. The Hellfire missile weighs 100 pounds. It carries a warhead of 20 pounds. You compare that to the warheads on most manned aircraft, 500, 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs with warheads of about half that size in each case. So you're talking about 10% of the payload of the smallest available bomb otherwise. So this allows you to conduct such attacks with a much, much lower footprint, much lower possibility of causing collateral damage. It doesn't mean collateral damage won't happen, but it's done because it will make that as small as possible. And we have heard also about the questions about civilian casualties. Are civilian casualties as significant as some people say? Right? The U.S. says 0, or at least Brennan said 0 at one point. Others are saying hundreds or even thousands or more than that. But the one thing that is indisputable, if you go to any side of this debate, go to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Their website is one of the best trackers of drone strikes around the world, and one of the most critical of drones. It always has the highest estimate of the 3 websites out there of the number of civilian casualties caused. And there's no question that in the last 2 to 3 years, because of measures that the U.S. has taken to reduce civilian casualties, those numbers have gotten almost infinitesimally small, even according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 5% of the people killed being civilians. You compare those numbers to the other ways that wars have been fought recently, asymmetric wars, in which the enemy hides amongst the civilian population, doesn't wear uniforms, doesn't carry arms openly, all requirements of the laws of war. Those wars have been characterized by civilian casualties of 50, 60, 70, even 90% of those killed in such wars have been civilians in places like Sri Lanka and Chechnya and the West Bank and Gaza. And so when you're talking about single-digit civilian casualties as a percentage, that is a truly remarkable achievement that can only be achieved by drones. But let's move on to the question of then legality. Right? Are we able to and allowed to use drones in places like Yemen and the Fatah regions of Pakistan? Professor O'Connell has made it clear that she believes the answer to that is no. That it is illegal to cross borders to strike individuals unless there is self-defense or unless there is a war going on there. Well, in Yemen, the answer is that there is a war going on there. And there has been a war going on there for several years now between Ansar al-Sharia, which is the domestic arm of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and AQAP, those two groups combined against the Yemeni government. That's been going on for several years. They have been successful enough on the battlefield at times to control up to a quarter of the country. They've imposed Sharia law on over 1.3 million people for over a year in the southeast corner of the country. And only with the assistance of U.S. drones and air power have the Yemeni army been able to push Ansar al-Sharia and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula out of those population centers and regain control of the country. So in Yemen, for the vast majority of the strikes involved, there has been permission from the Yemeni government. There has been an ongoing civil war occurring inside the country that the U.S. is allowed to participate in with the permission of the Yemeni government. We are clearly a common cause in that AQAP is also a threat to the United States to the extent that they were involved in the attempted bombing over Detroit on Christmas Day several years ago, the toner cartridges bombs that were sent to Chicago, the liquid explosive attempts that have been made on airliners over the Atlantic. There are a number of, it's clear that AQAP still intends to and continues to attempt to inflict damage on U.S. soil to the extent they can. So that's Yemen. And that's the reason for the continued drone strikes in Yemen, because there's a war going on there. And Philip Alston, who was the next rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, I believe Professor O'Connell cited an earlier one. Professor Alston, when asked about whether there was a war going on in Yemen about 6 months ago, said yes, that there's no doubt that there is an armed conflict going on in Yemen. Members of the ICRC asked the same question, come to the same personal evaluation of that. There's an armed conflict going on there, which means the laws of armed conflict apply to that conflict and allow for the use of force like drones. What about Pakistan? That's a harder question. There's no question about that, because Pakistan is not clearly consenting to all drone strikes there, and there is not clearly a civil war going on in Pakistan. So you can't use the co-belligerency argument that you would use in Yemen to justify drone strikes in Pakistan. So how do you do that? How does the United States do that? Through the law of self-defense. Professor O'Connell has said that every nation has responsibilities to Article 2.4, to the UN Charter. They also have responsibilities to prevent their territory from being used by others to conduct attacks on other nations. That is clearly the responsibility of all nations, and it grows out of and is a continuation of the law of neutrality that existed prior to the UN Charter being created. Right? During wartime, in traditional wars, you got to remember the Geneva Conventions written in 1949 did not contemplate, and no one would argue they did, the kinds of conflicts that we see today with non-state actors crossing international boundaries to fight wars against states. But their conception of war was the traditional international armed conflict between nations, France versus Germany, for example. And if you had such a war and you were a French soldier, you could not escape from the German army by crossing into Belgium, because Belgium would not allow you to. Belgium was neutral. And Belgium had a responsibility to keep you from crossing into Belgium and then using that as a sanctuary, as a safe haven, from which you could then come back in to Germany or into France to re-engage in the fight. You're not allowed to do that. Belgium has to prevent you from doing it, and you are not, as a combatant, allowed to do that. If you cross into Belgium, you were supposed to be interred for the balance of the war. And that is what happened when combatants went into neutral territory. That's what happened to the crew of the Graf Spee, the German pocket battleship that was scuttled in Uruguay, Montevideo Harbor. The Uruguayans, who were neutral, interred that crew for the balance of the war, because that's what you were supposed to do as a neutral. Now we're talking about a situation in which there is a war going on in Afghanistan. Everybody agrees with that. One of the participants in the war in Afghanistan are the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, based in Pakistan. They come across the border, they conduct attacks against Afghan, U.S. coalition forces, and then they come back across the border in an attempt to gain sanctuary. Pakistan has a responsibility to prevent that from happening. To the extent that they are either unable or unwilling to do so, the United States or others can, in self-defense, cross the border to prevent such attacks from continuing. And the United States is not the only country that has made that claim. In fact, every nation that has been involved in asymmetric armed conflicts with irregular armed forces over the last 20 or 30 years has made a similar claim and done similar things. That would be Turkey crossing into Iraq to go after the PKK. That would be Colombia crossing into Ecuador to go after the FARC. That would be Iran crossing into Iraq in the past few years to go after the MEK. That would be Israel crossing into Lebanon to go after Hezbollah. And the United States crossing over into Pakistan to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. This is what states do. And this is what all states confronted with such situations have done over the past couple of decades. And that is arguably customary law. To the extent that you would say, what do states do when presented with these situations? They put a burden on the other nation, the host nation. There's no argument that Pakistan is directing these attacks. And our attacks on Pakistan are not against the Pakistani army or against the Pakistani government. These are against Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces that are coming across the border and attacking United States forces and Afghan forces in Afghanistan. And those attacks can be forestalled if Pakistan were to live up to its international obligation to prevent them. They do not have to arrest those individuals. They do not have to hand them over to the United States. They merely have to get them off of their territory. Pakistan cannot harbor organizations and participants in an armed conflict indefinitely. We have to give them an opportunity to do something about that. That opportunity has been given on a number of occasions, and they have proven both unable in some cases and unwilling in other cases to do anything about it. The most famous unwilling case would be Osama bin Laden. We live a mile from the Pakistani military college, and it's clear that for 7 years Pakistan was unwilling to do anything about that. And the operation to get bin Laden was a military operation using the tools of armed conflict. It was not a law enforcement operation designed to capture bin Laden. And so to the extent that operation was justified by the laws we were talking about, so are other similar operations against forces that are trying to cross the border and do harm to Afghan and U.S. forces. Thank you.
Thank you.